Welcome to the Practice Podcast, conversations probing the nature of practice. I'm your host, Dave Fearon. We call the basis of the podcast series Enaction, Social Enaction. And Enaction Research is the name of our webpage, enactionresearch.com. Who is the hour? My son Dave and I. We are both very interested in the convergence of conversation as practice and practice as it is enacted through conversation. That juncture can be seen in a sample of conversation as short as 30 seconds, if you know what to look for. So in this conversation, Dave will review some of the points of what to look for when trying to understand how relationships are formed and lost, how emotions are improved or worsened, and how the topic of conversation, which starts at one point, can quickly change to an altogether different one in the blink of an eye. It's quite remarkable, and I hope you agree. So this is Dave and Dad. Well, I am taking us to school with my son Dave. Back when we first started this podcast series, Peter Vale and I, we decided that conversation was the way we were going to be going through the semi-outline of the manuscript called Practice is a Way of Being. And as it turned out, we got so interested in ideas as they flowed back and forth in our conversation that sometimes we forgot where we started and didn't care. So conversation has always been a fascination. So I brought in Dave, who has done a lot of thinking and writing about social inaction, because that is the realm of conversation. So it ties together practice and conversation as a framework. And Dave and I will talk through that for your benefit, and then we'll take it maybe a little further on about some ideas for use. Dave, hello.
Hello.
So collaborative change scopes down to moments. Now think about this a minute. Scopes down to moments of conversation, just a few minutes, and we have collaborative change happening. We're talking about huge changes in the world right now that we see. Yet when we look very closely at even the most impactful changes, we can find people in conversation where the ideas about that are morphing and changing and flowing along as people take turn talking. It sounds so simple, but it's the way society is sustained, I think. Dave can correct me.
That sounds about right.
In fact, there's big two-person conversation going on in the world right now between world leaders. So it does put it in perspective. Now, change actually emerges as enacted practice. This is an idea that Dave will be talking about in more detail. But why did we call our webpage Social Enaction, Enaction Research? It's a rather different kind of word. We don't use it every day, and Dave will explain it and why it is so important to understand inaction and practice, because both happen in the moment. There is no practice before or after the moment. It's in the moment. Memory or recording or other devices can capture what was said and done. Doing is practice, but that moment is what we're going to focus on in this conversation tonight. To give you a little heads up, we're also going to be presenting these ideas at a conference of management and organization behavior professors, a virtual conference coming up in a few weeks. So this is a bit of a rehearsal for that. So what we'll do is explore what is revealed in the briefest moments of three levels of conversation and how that prompts collaborative change practices. Dave, take us to the next step.
Okay, and we're going to give an example of a previous podcast guest, and I'm going to step us through a little clip of a conversation between your host and Deanna Pendleton, which I forgot to note which number podcast they were on, but what we're going to do is use this perspective of social inaction to think about a different way of listening to conversation. Normally, when we listen to conversation and interact ourselves, we're mostly focusing on the topic. What are people talking about? Mm-hmm. But can you also, and maybe even simultaneously, listen to how people build their talk as a practice? And also, how do they manage social relationships? So as a practice, there's a practice of conversation. There's a ways of mixing all the different levels of linguistics right up to very common ways of constructing conversational interaction. And then there's also simultaneously and constantly, mostly even more subtle ways of managing social relationships through what you say, through gestures, through the colors of someone's skin, if they blush, all kinds of different ways. So it can, and when you have a recording and when you have a transcript, then you can start pulling apart the different elements that might be hidden within those other levels of conversation, and then think about how would that matter for understanding concepts such as organization, change, and practice, and can we notice them as we listen to how talk progresses? So I talk next about what we mean by social inaction, and I introduced this, I think, probably in our first talk, but it's a term that I'm using to bring out three common meanings of the term enact. One is to perform. It's a talk is a performance. Conversational participants orient their talk to each other and to what could be mutually understandable and relevant to each other, treating each person as an audience to their own, to what they say. So it is almost this dramaturgical notion of performance, but it's also a way of doing. And in doing, there's the next definition of enact is to bring forth. In this performance, through it, participants develop topics, they categorize people, things, events, and both directly and also with an applied context that participants in conversation are also building and bringing forth and maintaining that mutual understanding. And it's that mutual understanding that's key.
Oh yeah.
If that breaks apart, then your conversation breaks apart.
Let me break apart for a moment here, because I think that notion of implied context is ties very much into the way we've defined. Peter and I have said practice is achieving results in changing circumstances and learning wherever the context your practice brings you to. So this notion of context is very important, but you're saying in a way that the context is created in conversation.
Very much so. Yep. And if you're thinking of this practice of inaction, you're really not thinking of deep past. You're not thinking of the future. You're thinking of how people bring forth indications of what they're talking about at the moment, which might be past, which might be future. But it's really that mutuality, that bringing forth the social in that moment and through that action. And a third part of that, though, is it's kind of a stretch of the definition of an act, to act from authority, to use what people say and what each person ought to know in order to warrant and hold each other accountable to what's being said, to what became before, to the relevant social context at the moment. People are kind of invoking those, but also holding each other accountable in the sense that if you were to do a disagreement, you would tend to do so in a way that has an explanation based on what someone might not assume or might not know about the immediate moment. So, and part of the consequence of holding each other accountable, warranting action in what was said and done and what people ought to know is that they also are simultaneously managing relationships and the quality of the ongoing social relationship. So in order to argue, this is something you'd enact through your performance, but it would be something that has consequences for the immediate relationship as well.
I know, having looked ahead a little, that this notion of relationships is going to be something we're going to be watching for in the clip with Deanna. But I also remember way back when you were doing this research originally, you came to one of my classes and you talked about close and distant. It was such a powerful idea. So right in these moments, maybe this is where authority kicks in, depending on how the other aspects of an action are working at the time. People could be either drawn closer to each other, or something could be said, or there could be a gesture or anything, and that will move them apart. Is that close to what you taught me months years ago?
Yeah,
that's pretty significant, I think, for social.
Yeah, and it works pretty well. I mean, I think the clip that we're doing is pretty much two people who are in agreement and have maintain a good social relationship. But we'll also though look at the social relationships that people talk about. That's part of it as well. So what we'll do now is look at this little clip, and we're going to watch a conversation being performed and following along these three levels of an action, but also looking at three levels of enacted practice, which we can look at the topical, the conversational, and relational. So topically, what are the two people talking about for each other at each moment? So this is, and as we listen to this is sort of, again, the ordinary way of listening.
Mm-hmm.
But we could also look at some of the conversational dynamics. How is the social linguistic practice of talk being built up as a topical organization during that moment? And there's a whole field of research that gets into that, which I won't get into lots of terms, but just taking turns at talk, telling stories, interrupting, acknowledging one another. These are all things that have to be done, and most of the time we don't even notice we're doing it. And then the relational level, we'll look a little bit about that. What's the emerging quality relationships participants are building with each other, and the relationships being talked about. And you won't be able to see the video, but we've already posted a version of this on the website where you can actually see this little clip and see the emotional performance and facial expressions and gestures that go along with it. So let's try this and see if it works. And I'm going to play just a few. I'll do the conversational exchange in two parts and then kind of go through an analysis of each of the levels of the two parts as we go.
Mm-hmm. So wait, before you start, there's a history of who these two people are and all the rest, but really all that matters for our eye right now and our ear for the podcast is what's happening when two people are talking with each other. And maybe not without any setup as to who everyone is and what their backgrounds is. It might be even more revealing how important it is to listen carefully for those three levels. And then we can kind of reveal a little bit more later. But I guess we can say that Deanna is her name, and Dave is the name of the person speaking with her.
And it is on a podcast, so she's speaking before an audience.
Yes, that it's being she's recorded. Well aware that it's a public talk.
Yeah, that's important to note that. So, so let's
do it.
Try to make sure I can actually.
And it's been, like I said, as much of an education as this has been, and how much I've enjoyed it. For me, actually going through these conversations with some of my friends who are small business owners, who are entrepreneurs, who are trying to figure out how to find the way forward in this, perpetual state of digital transformation. We've pretty much understood now that you're never going to be transformed and then finished, right? It's going to be a never-ending cycle of
put an ing after transform. We're transforming.
Exactly. You're transforming almost daily,
Okay, sorry, I was clipped a little bit of that, but so I'll kind of semi-read some of the transcript as I go, and
okay,
just a little bit of context is if you could hear, she's kind of talking broadly, but she was this comes in where she's continuing a point on reevaluating her level of impact for a fast-paced short-term sales project that she's been part of, and is building off there. So this moment topically is building off to a more broad point about the perpetual transformation that's in her industry.
So that's your topic then, huh?
Yeah, that's the topic. And, you could tell that Dave also is following along with the topic and expands it by, putting an ing after transform. But, you could tell, but both parties certainly recognize the topic, but how they do it, some of the aspects you could sort of think about at the conversational level. So she says, and it's been, like, as I said, as much of a education as has been, and how much I've enjoyed it for me going through these conversations with my friends who are small business owners, who are entrepreneurs and are trying to figure out how to find a way forward in this. So she's using how much I've enjoyed it as a preface, an example that she's building up as kind of a contrast that's going to emphasize and build upon her prior characterization of this commentary about digital transformation. So a way of making that point, and then Dave comes in with a laugh and put an ing after transform. We're transforming, using that, and the way he does it by actually overlapping her talk is a way of emphasizing this notion of transform, and in that way emphasizing and agreeing with her point, and that agreement becomes that little moment of relationship. So from she's telling a story, an example that at a relational level kind of acknowledges the value of work relationships, and in contrast with this unfulfilling pace that she's driven to in her job.
Oh yeah.
And then she also mentions friends. So there's kind of this community of people in similar conditions. So even this notion of solidarity around the common struggle is kind of a relational level as well. And then Dave comes in with a laugh and an agreement, which can accomplish or enact this commiseration.
Yep.
So you have, all these moments, and then so now as they continue, they are at this point of agreement, and she now continues her example.
Transforming almost daily. Our long-term business plans now are 6 months.
Yeah.
Gone are the days of the 5 years strategy plan. So, Yeah, I've made the decision to, my job, they informed me that was my job was going to Singapore, and that I'd be have the opportunity to, reapply and try to see if I could get into the same business unit that I was in Singapore, which was even further away from my family. And it was really interesting for me that as driven as I am, and how type A that I am and goal oriented that I am, normally I feel 20-year-old Deanna probably would have been like, okay, I'm packing my bag. And when
bags are packed. Yeah. Where's the dog? Will they let me bring the dog?
And so she's kind of gone. So we going again topically, she starts with this broader point about reevaluating her level of impact, and talking about her friends in the industry are making this balance between, the fast pace, and missing that those relationships with the customer. But now she's talking about, so I made a decision, my job, they informed me my job was going to Singapore, and that I would have the opportunity to reapply and see if I could get into some same business unit that I was in Singapore, which is even further from my family. So right now she's in Dubai. So
yeah. You think you're close to your family when you're in Dubai. You figure how far you'd be when you're in China.
Yeah. So
Singapore.
Yeah. So the way, so note the way she's phrasing it. She's explaining a decision, but then indicates that her company is asking her to reapply for the Singapore job transfer. And then she continues, indicating it's further from her family, but she would normally go for it. And Dave agrees with this portrayal. Yeah, my bags are packed. Where's the dog? Well, let me bring my dog. So conversationally, we could kind of focus on how she did this, how she portrayed herself as basically being transferred after being quite successful with the work she'd been doing in Dubai.
Mm-hmm.
So she starts out, so I've made a decision to, my job, starts out talking about herself, her decision. And then they informed me my job was going to Singapore. So cutting that off in the first person and going to more of a passive voice, my job was going, and that I would have the opportunity to reapply. So you can almost hear that corporate speak and the way of doing that corporate speak, jumping from the personal to the impersonal. So I made a decision, my job, they informed me my job was going to Singapore.
Yeah.
And then back to, which is even further from my family, and then continues. I'm normally, I'm goal oriented, and normally I feel 20-year-old Deanna would be like, okay, I'm packing my bag. And Dave says, yeah, bags are packed. Where's the dog? Will they let me bring my dog? So he's kind of expanding on that kind of hypothetical example that she gave.
Yeah.
But it's really kind of interesting at the relational level when you start looking at how she's framing this, basically being told not just that her job was transferring, but that she has to reapply for her own job.
Yeah. That was a moment where, another aspect of what you've talked about in other podcasts is this notion of shame and pride. And I think that would have been a really key moment, since that announcement about her company making that change came out of the blue, to me anyway, or to Dave. And so you've got that key moment there where the next few sentences could have made this a very awkward public podcast episode for her and for Dave. So let's see what do you think? What follows here? How did they hold that together at the relational level?
Yeah, I mean because it is, so let's see how she started. If she had continued. So I made this decision, my job she kind of almost started out, I've made the decision to do something about this transfer, but then maybe reframing it in this passive voice way. They informed me my job was going to Singapore and that I would have the opportunity to reapply. Now, from your perspective, all of a sudden it's like she's now given an account for having to change a job, and it's no longer just her decision. It's a decision made for her. And then even using that passive voice is kind of a way of demonstrating, you could almost call it the sense of corporate disrespect, to make someone who's been very successful then go and compete for her own job somewhere else. And then you can even go from there and say, well, being a woman in a technology job, man's world, and even in the Middle East, even more of a man's world, probably in the business world. So really, you can kind of build out from there, but it's just that moment, and it's not, and you've already kind of done agreements, and she could expect some sympathy, but there's various ways of doing sympathy too. So if you look at, she continues with, I was in Singapore, which would be in Singapore, even further away from my family. It was really interesting me as driven as I am to how type A I am. So kind of calling upon your knowledge of her, and goal oriented, that I feel 20-year-old Diana would be okay. So she's doing this justification, somewhat self-deprecating way to explain her decision.
Yeah.
And then when you have the next turn, which you kind of jump in with, you are doing kind of my bags are packed. Where's the dog? Will they let me bring my dog? So you're kind of building upon the example that she was portraying. And
the 20-year-old Deanna would have most likely have jumped on it. And I think what I was doing is agreeing with her that I knew her being what she just described, goal-oriented type A, from way back. And in a way, I think I was trying to hold on to the relationship because I only had an instant to think about what she just told me.
Yeah. But you did it in a well, there's ways of doing. There's ways of putting your foot in your mouth.
Oh yeah,
being disrespectful. But I think the instinct here, the way it was portrayed, would be to at least show some respect, some solidarity, some commiseration, perhaps. I think we could stop there. There's certainly more that the conversation goes along with, but I think this kind of gives the sense in this interview, publicly displayed self kind of situation, that all three of these dynamics are at play, and you can really just take these little clips and build upon them to get more and more details, or you can take longer stretches of talk, a full conversation, or some crucial moments if you did have a recorded negotiation or something like that, or taping your latest argument with your spouse. That could be fun too. but there's you can see this building of this the topical, but also the conversational, which is doing some of these mechanical ways of organizing what you want to do with a talk. So in order for her to, like in this last bit, in order for her to explain how her decision, so her initial thinking about this decision that was forced on her for changing her job, she did it conversationally by kind of stopping one direction and that was more direct about herself, and then switching to passive voice. And you'll see, the more you understand the dynamics of conversation, you see lots of little, very common ways that we use our conversation, in even pauses and overlapping talk and interruptions, to do this relational work, in addition to managing the topic that you're trying to get the other person to mutually understand.
Yeah, it's very delicate. And it could be a conversation about the weather in a way initially, but as it gets started, if you want to have it go beyond that to, and by the way, my name's Dave, what's yours, and build it into something on a continuing basis, how you've even handled that first exchange as a practice of conversation could end up with someone saying, well, no, I've got to run, or yeah, let's take another minute. I'll tell you a little bit more about myself. So that's like the most innocuous points, but there's the stakes for good quality conversation, relationships that come from those conversations are very high in many sorts of business aspects, from selling to, negotiating a contract, wherever the moments have results that could be enacting something better or worse for the participants and the organization that they have enacted in their heads in that moment is pretty significant, isn't it, Dave?
Yeah. And sometimes you're trying to juggle, the corporate message that you've been given, like in a sales negotiation. You have to have, your boss is making you get this price, and the other guy's boss is making them get to that price. And
yeah,
at some point, you're mutually trying to figure out how to appease both bosses. Probably and people start to level each other at that point.
Yeah, and as well as this person you're having that negotiating with, you might want to be seeing her again, for another negotiation, so you don't want to have a conversation that sputters and dies. It makes it harder to recover the next moment. You can get that person to talk to you about some aspect of the sale that was just made, or something else that you'd like to do. And I think one of the neat things, Dave, about bringing our eye all the way down to a very few seconds of conversation, with this larger context sort of out there, but you can, rather than paying attention to every sight and sound, you hone in with the tools you mentioned, like a good recording or a good video or good transcript. You hone in on, and you put a bracket around a small piece of conversation. And I think the audio is better even than the written transcript, because you hear the sounds. You hear sort of a little bit of a self-effacing laugh on her part, just a moment of, well, and those are things that don't always show up unless you right into the analysis, which you used to do, self-effacing laugh. Yeah.
There's like software now where you can code all these kind of things right onto the video and transcript. So, but it's also, I've, knowing these different levels for so many years, I can't say that I've ever gotten myself into those Zen moments where I'm able to pay attention to all three levels at the same time. Every now and then I'll remember to notice the relational dynamics, but then forgetting what I'm talking about. So I think the brain hides those two levels. Largely hides the conversational, especially because that's like, thinking about all the muscles in your hand as you are trying to play the piano and telling each finger what key to press. And similarly, I think the relational too is more, and it's probably like one of those right brain, left brain things where there is a big, very large part of your cognition paying a very close attention to that, but it's not always telling your speaking part of your brain. Until someone either makes it very clear that you've ignored something important in the relationship, or you just notice you may. I've always thought that feelings are communicative even to yourself. Parts of your body and brain are talking to other parts of the body and brain. So you'll notice, why am I feeling edgy at the moment? Oh, I see.
Yeah. And yet you don't really
be fired.
Yeah, but or relocated if I want to apply for my job and compete for my job, which is another one of those things that happen in corporate America all the time. We're reorganizing, and so we don't want to let you go altogether. We'll give you a chance to compete for your job, which is very common occurrence. But very difficult, and where the whole notion of pride and shame and all those other emotions that stem off of them come into play. So let's do a little review for the listener, and then we'll talk a little bit more after that. So what again do they should be seeing and hearing about a good role of conversation that they're playing part of, or at least watching?
Well, I again, it's that thinking about what is there beyond the topical that makes the topic, not just your understanding of what is being talked about, but how are two or more people in the conversation making that topic real and meaningful, and mutually understood. That's a practice, and it's one that both involves these conversational levels, all the parts, the social linguistic practices, and that put it all together, but also this relational. And it's the relational that kind of gives that sense of enaction, as there's kind of a mutual agreement about what's the authority behind what's being mutually understood at that moment, and what ought to be known. So, in that brief conversation, you were expected to understand what Deanna was talking about.
Yes.
And had you not quite got the subtlety of her, her revelation that her job was changing, she would have had to try again
and explain it more carefully. And then it could become a much different feeling of conversation, couldn't it? You wouldn't have that sense of collaboration. And I think that's where we started the set. We talk about collaboration. Talk a little bit about what it means to be collaborating a conversation, not just collaborating for a conversation, but actually taking these turns as a way of collaborating. Isn't it doing this connecting and doing the labor, if you will, of keeping a conversation going, so that topic can become realized more clearly, so that people then have a better sense of what they want each other to say, that whole notion of accountability. So
and that's not to say that the topic is then reified, because you can see that it's not something that has its own power, in the sense both parties have to keep building and rebuilding what the topic is at each moment. So, and that's also an interesting way to think about the live dynamic of talk. The meanings of words are not stable. They are not pre-given. They always would have to be renewed for that moment. And in that sense, created for that moment. And that's another aspect of enaction. It's very much looking at the now and the ongoing present.
So like the moment where she said a transformation, and I quickly added the ing. We took that one word, which then was the topic of that instant. I'm transforming. My job is transforming. And she was saying, nothing stays the same very long. So I said, well, why don't we, to think of it as more transformed being. And she instantly agreed. So in a way, we took that topic and gave it a little bit more airtime and a little bit more power. And then after that, if we were to play the whole rest of this short clip, which we don't have time for now, if right after that moment, you'd begin to see how we could use the fact that we understand now that there is a transformation, and it's happening, and it's happening to her even before she expected it. So we could shift our talking just about that, or we could continue to do what this was to be, which is what's going on in your life these days. Take me through your what's going on, so we can get an understanding of what you do. So you see what happened right after that transforming comment.
Well, we could go ahead and play it. Let's
play it. Yeah, let's get some fun. Time, thriving. And so I hope that when you do close.
Oh, sorry, I'll start over.
Okay. Thriving. And so I hope that when you do close the deal, whatever the next deal will be for you, that you'll make sure that there's some way that you can get that wonderful satisfaction. To say it worked. Does that make sense?
Definitely. And I think that's the thing is, again, is being in that stillness. I recognize really it is about finding more moments of joy for yourself, finding really what makes you happy. And I'm a builder, I might not actually, I do, I even like building things in my house or with wood or, whatever it is. I'm a builder. And when I think about how I can consult to a company and I'm actually helping to build that infrastructure and create it and watch it thrive, those are the moments of joy that I just wasn't getting anymore working in a large company.
Of course not. Yeah.
And that could, that's just particular to me. I know a lot of people when I was talking about leaving are like, how, God, like people would kill for your job and everybody would love to work for a large company and, they're Fortune 100, Fortune 50. How could you give it up? But it's just not a good fit for me. I need to be in someplace a little bit smaller, where at least even if it's not about the size of the company, it's about the amount of impact I have the ability to deliver.
It is. So what about that? Wasn't that amazing?
Yeah. So what do you see there? Just briefly.
Well, in just that, maybe 23 seconds. I don't know how long that was.
About a minute. Yeah.
An awful lot came up. Her self-image as a builder, that goes to a very basic level of practice. Well, I have a professorship and all the other things. What I really am is a teacher, and I'll teach anywhere. And because she sees herself as someone who builds, that means someone who would be more involved in the starting up of things, which indeed she did for this job some years back. She created this job for her company out in the Middle East. So she's got that feeling like, if I'm going to be a builder, I want to build so I can be closer to the results, which you'd get if she were in a smaller company. So that, and we don't know if she's actually going to go to a smaller company. She's taking these ideas out and sharing them with a friend who I am, a mentor, and testing them. And I think I was at that moment, I put probably a little more power into the conversation where I said, you've got to be sure this is something that's good for you, that you feel good about. There was a bit of preaching there, but I so many people get burned out in these corporate jobs. And they just get that feeling of, if I got to do this 10 more years, I can't do it. And so I was saying, well, here's a time, good moment. Find out what you like to do best and she said, and I want to have joy.
Yeah. So it's really a lot of vulnerable presentation of self. That she certainly couldn't have with her HR people.
No, not that moment.
Or the people who made the decision to transfer her. Then if you were wondering why, you felt that way, then when you do look at in the interpretation you just gave, when you can then go back and look, well, let's look at the details of how this was done. And the agreement and the points at which she is kind of stammering a bit. Those could be seen as moments of embarrassment or saying things that were more sensitive. But then you at that moment you give a little signs of agreement and encouragement.
Yeah.
So yeah, you can really then dig down deep and look at how it's actually done to achieve that mutual topical conversation.
Wow. Well, as we're moving down on the last few minutes of our podcast recording time, Dave, we're going to show some colleagues who teach organization behavior how to look with almost like a microscope at a little sample of people talking, me and this other person, and looking through these three levels, if maybe one at a time, hardly able to do it at the same time, but getting that sense that there's always going to be a topic. There's always going to be the work or practice of conversation to make that topic even a topic, and that if it's going well, however you want to define well, meaning people are not pulling themselves apart and basically hoping to end the conversation, they're moving closer, there's more energy. That's what we look for in organization behavior. If that's what we look for when we're looking for leadership happening. Because leadership is an occurrence, not a role. It happens or it doesn't. So you can see it in a little clip of conversation. Maybe what I was trying to do was reinforce and lead her in the direction of looking even more deeply into alternative jobs in small startups. That could have been a leadership moment. She could have pushed back on it, saying, "No, actually, but so there's so much you can see."
Yeah. Yeah, there is. And we did a version of this talk for a conference, Evolve 2021, and we put the whole session up on the Enaction Research website. So if you go to enactionresearch.com and look under content and videos, you'll find it currently as the first item up there, Evolve 2021. And hopefully it is still working so that you can see that session.
Yeah. Well, I hope people do. I hope people have two huge curiosities as a result of all the work that you and I and then Peter started doing. And that is a real curiosity about how they are in practice in so many ways. And now, including that they have to get very good at conversing. It's not speeches alone, conversing, two or more people, a small group, taking turns and doing a whole lot of important inaction in that particular practice. And then the other is that something that we just take for granted, but it happens, I would guess, if we had a proportion of our day where we were in conversation, either electronically or face-to-face, as we're coming more back to face-to-face, it would be 60, what do you guess, 60, 70% of our time we're in conversation in a work day?
It could be, yeah. It depends on the job. I think I'm down to 20%, but I'm writing long emails all the time. It's getting annoying.
Unfortunately, those can't be very conversational, even if you write it in a tone, because you don't have that instant, feedback and be able to look at someone's eyes and see how they're reacting. Yeah. But I think, for a lot of jobs, it may be 20%, it may be 60%. But my point is that it's almost close to as basic as breathing. Yeah. As social animals, there are very few ways that we can hold ourselves in any sense of society, community, family, friendship, work relationship, if we aren't able to enact those moments through conversation. Yeah. Is that a fair analysis?
It is, yeah. And a whole other conversation about how Zoom and then chat things like Slack and texting starts to break down aspects of that and what that means.
That is an important conversation for another time.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Dave. I will stop the recording, and we'll wrap up, and we'll have another episode in the works by tomorrow. I'm getting good at doing all this editing and getting it up on the web, so this one will be a lot of fun to get up there. Thank you.
Thanks.
If you'd like to hear more, listen in on Spotify, Automatic, and Apple Podcasts, or go to enactionresearch.com/podcast-page. And if you'd like to learn more about social inaction and the nature of practice, head over to enactionresearch.com for more information. Thank you for supporting this show. We look forward to hearing from you soon.